Hi. This is part one in a trilogy of videos that I'm doing of readings from my book, The Spiritual Roots of the Tarot. And it's from chapter 6, which is entitled Justice, Time and Chance. And it's 3 subsections within that chapter, primarily focused on the Wheel of Fortune. And so this is the first of 3 of them, and this one's entitled The Wheel of Fortune and Chance. Please bear with me as I read to you from my text here. In the last decade of the 15th century, Boldo degli Ubaldi, and excuse me if my Italian pronunciation's a little off, was an academic at Pavia University in what would become his last tenure as a professor of law. Baldo had held tenure at universities all through Lombardy and elsewhere throughout Italy. His body of work on legalities would be significant for centuries. Sometime between 1390 and 1395, Gian Galeazzo Visconti presented him with a manuscript that included an illumination called Del Consolatione Philosophiae, which is the consolation of philosophy. Crafted by a notable Italian painter and illumination artist, Michelino da Besozio, whose patrons were the Visconti and Pietro da Pavia, who typically wrote texts for Michelino's work, the gift of the 75-page manuscript was in recognition of his contribution to the university and to law. Besides a deathbed scene where Boethius is surrounded by a bevy of women, the illumination includes the Wheel of Fortune, reminiscent of the style that was popular at that time. 2 of the figures on the wheel have been rubbed out intentionally, just leaving Fortuna in the centre and the 2 remaining women. It's of interest that the 2 who have been removed represent ill fortune, with only the aspects of good fortune remaining. It was as if leaving the depictions of ill fortune on the illustration would be a bad omen. A book called The Consolation of Philosophy, from which the illumination was inspired, was referred to in the medieval period as the scholar's familiar companion. Along with Petrarch's books, it would have been included in the extensive library of the Pavia University. The book's influence was unparalleled, as evidenced by it having been translated into every European tongue. It was written by Amicus Manilius Severinus Boethius, that's his full name, who lived at the turn of the 5th century. He had the good fortune of being awarded the highest position in civil administration, Magister Officiorum, during the reign of Theodoric, the Ostrogoth king, who through his conquests had made himself master of Italy. Life for Boethius was good as it gets, married with 2 sons, who, in an unprecedented act by the king, were made joint consuls while still quite young. And it could be said then that Boethius had everything going for him. As fate would have it, within 12 months of what could only be called his greatest triumph, the appointment of his sons as consuls, Boethius is a solitary prisoner at Pavia, stripped of honours, wealth and friends, with a strong prospect of facing execution. His greatest terror was the repercussions might also extend to his family. His trumped-up charge of treason was upheld, and shortly after writing The Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius is brutally executed. It's uncertain which form his execution takes, but one account says he was cut down by soldiers' swords right before Theodoric's judgment seat. Another account says a rope was fashioned around his head and tightened until his eyes popped, and then he was bludgeoned with a club. Either way, it was barbaric. Boethius explains how he is distraught with grief, almost angry at the injustice of his misfortunes. He resorts to writing verses about how he is feeling to give some relief to his melancholy. Suddenly, a woman of great dignity and beauty appears before him, being the divine figure of philosophy. Through a succession of very direct discussions, she describes in detail the nature of fortune and convinces him of the vanity of regret for gifts, position, intelligence, and family that had been afforded him by fortune. She helps him to bring his mind back to focusing on the true good, that which is divine. Philosophy reminds Boethius, quote, "Thou hast resigned thyself to the sway of fortune. Thou must submit to the mistress's caprices. What? Art thou verily striving to stay the swing of the revolving wheel? O stupidest of mortals, if it takes to standing still, it ceases to be the wheel of fortune." End of quote. This concept of a wheel symbolizing good and ill fortune emerged as a Roman concept in the 3rd century BCE, attested by what is thought to be 2 temples dedicated to Fortuna around 293 BCE. Some of the earliest references to the fickle nature of the Wheel of Fortune are in Seneca's tragedy Agamemnon, written in the 1st century CE. Quote, "O Fortune, who dost bestow the throne's high boon with making hand, in dangerous and doubtful state thou settest the too exalted. Never have sceptres obtained calm peace or certain tenure. Care on care weighs them down, and ever do fresh storms vex their souls. Great kingdoms sink to their own weight, and fortune gives way beneath the burden of herself. Sails swollen with favouring breezes, fear blast too strongly theirs. The tower which rears its head to the very clouds is beaten by rainy, austere, the southerly winds. Whatever fortune raised on high, she lifts but to bring low. Modest estate has longer life. Then happy he, whoever, content with the common lot, with safe breeze hugs the shore, and fearing to trust his skiff to the wider sea, with unambitious oars keeps close to land." End of quote. Italy's most famous inlaid mosaic floor in the Siena Cathedral, a church dedicated to Mary, depicts 56 tiled scenes. The first laid during the 14th century extensions to the cathedral was the Wheel of Fortune. In 1502, the story of Fortuna was also added, giving testament to the significance that fortune played in the beliefs of medieval Christians. It's a paradox that a pagan concept managed to sustain such inclusivity in Christianity for as long as it did. The Camina Burana, a manuscript housing a collection of 254 poems and dramatic texts, was thought to have been created between the 11th and 13th century near the region of the German-Austrian border. One miniature illumination depicts the Wheel of Fortune in a style similar to the wheel in the Siena Cathedral. An excerpt from one poem, Fortune, Empress of the World, reads, "Fate, monstrous and empty, you whirling wheel, you are malevolent. Well-being is vain, always may melt away, shadowy and veiled, you plague me too. Now, through the game barebacked, I bear your villainy." Geoffrey Chaucer, 1343 to 1400, English poet and author, met Petrarch, his Florentine contemporary, Giovanni Boccaccio in Lombardy during various missions between 1368 and 1378. It was in this time that he was introduced to medieval Italian poetry by his Italian contemporaries. One of Giovanni Boccaccio's more significant work was entitled, excuse me as I pronounce this, De Carcibus Virorum Illustrium, on the fates of famous men, which were essentially moral stories of the fall of famous men. An illumination from a 1457 Parisian manuscript uses the Wheel of Fortune to illustrate Boccaccio's theme. Inspired by the message of the wheel, Chaucer includes it in many of his works. The legacy of Boethius was immortalised by these medieval poets and authors, which also included authors like Dante and John Lingate. It's possible that Boethius's text had a strong influence on more than just the Wheel of Fortune in the trumps. The four states of human consciousness, power, wealth, love, and fame, that kept the fool shackled to the world of the evil god was integral to his message. The key Christian theme of not being attached to these values that rust, moths, and robbers make unsustainable is what allowed the Wheel of Fortune, with almost no scriptural rationale, to sit comfortably alongside more rigorously justified doctrines. To these four that were symbolised in the trumps as the emperor, the pope, the lover, and the chariot, Boethius adds a fifth element, which he describes as the supreme desire. Quote, "It is plain then that the only object sought for in all of these ways, wealth, rank, power, glory, and pleasure, is happiness. For that which each seeks in preference to all else, that is in his judgment the supreme good. And we have defined the supreme good to be happiness. So then these are the blessings men wish to win. They want riches, which is wealth, rank and sovereignty, which is power, glory, which is fame, and pleasure comes from the love, because they believe that by these means they will secure all the dimensions of happiness: independence, reverence, power, renown, and joy of heart." End of quote. Lady Philosophy goes to great length to help Boethius understand that he's allowed his happiness to be defined by something that came as a result of good fortune. She then helps him to see that fortune cannot aspire to bestow happiness by reason of its instability. Quote, "A man borne along by this transitory felicity must either know or not know its instability. If he knows not how poor is a happiness which depends on the blindness of ignorance, if he knows it, then he must fear to lose a happiness whose loss he believes to be possible. Wherefore, a never-ceasing fear suffers him not to be happy. Or does he count the possibility of this loss a trifling matter? Insignificant, then, must be the happiness whose loss can be borne so calmly." End of quote. This is the end of part one. Part 2 looks at the concept of good fortune versus ill fortune.